Hello, everyone. We're going to give it a minute or two while everybody files in. We already have some nice heart reactions, Maggie. Well loved. Great. All right, let's get started. So welcome, everyone. Today is World Dyslexia Awareness Day, where the topic of 2024 is What's Your Story? So I am thrilled to be able to introduce Professor Maggie Snowling to share her story with us today. Maggie is Professor Emerita of Psychology at the University of Oxford. She was also formerly the president of St. John's College, Oxford, where she continues as a research fellow and is a world-renowned expert on children's reading and language difficulties. In fact, she's the world's most cited academic in the field of dyslexia. So we're thrilled to be able to chat with Maggie today, learn more about her journey researching dyslexia and how we can support children who have a predisposition to dyslexia. Welcome, Maggie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening.
So to begin, many of our audience will know this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, could you give us a very quick description of what dyslexia is?
Okay, well, the simplest definition of dyslexia is it is a specific difficulty in learning to read and write fluently. It's quite important to stress this is a difficulty learning to read, that is learning to decode. We're not talking about reading comprehension, although often that's a consequence of dyslexia. And also, just to emphasize, fluency is really important because even people who learn to read with dyslexia, often they have ongoing problems with reading fluency into adulthood.
Thanks, Maggie. So as a researcher, you've been studying dyslexia for decades. Tell us a little bit more about your journey. Has your thinking around dyslexia changed or evolved over the years based on where your research has led you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I always like sharing my own story, but I guess my story really needs to start many, many years before I started as a researcher, because my younger brother by 3 years was severely dyslexic. And although I'd had no problems learning to read and I was doing well at school, he was in the absolute bottom class for his year. He wasn't very happy. He wasn't very well behaved, I have to say. But also I saw the stress that my mother was under trying to get his difficulties recognized and any treatment for them. So in a way, that's where my story starts. But some 15 years or more later, I studied psychology at the University of Bristol, and I wanted to go on to do a doctorate, which would address one of the sort of developmental disorders, as we called them, atypical development at the time. And at the time, this was in 1976, there was just an emergence of interest in experimental approaches to childhood autism, a condition that hadn't been sort of assessed or investigated by psychologists. And that was really what I wanted to look into. So I sought a distinguished supervisor, Uta Frith. I went to see her to ask if she would supervise my doctorate. And she said to me, well, I could. But she said, why do you want to study autism? There's quite a lot of that going on now. Why don't you look at dyslexia? Because there's no one applying an experimental approach to understand the difficulties of children learning to read. And so you can imagine, I thought, that rings a bell. Maybe it would be quite interesting to look at dyslexia and to use a cognitive approach to understand better the nature and the causes of this specific learning disorder. So I guess that's the start. Do you want me to just continue or?
Yeah, I think how about this second part of the question where you started off with dyslexia, a definition of dyslexia perhaps. Has that evolved or your thinking around dyslexia changed over the years?
Yeah, okay. So when I was studying dyslexia, it was to the extent that it was defined, there was a definition, the World Federation of Neurology definition in 1968, which emphasized that dyslexia is a difficulty learning to read in the face of good intelligence. This was called the discrepancy definition. So typically, children were being diagnosed as dyslexic if there was a discrepancy between their IQ and their expected level of reading and their actual level of reading. So that was one of the key features of the definition. My thesis, and along with work going on at the Haskins Labs in the US, and the work of many researchers there, was highlighting the problems learning to read being associated with verbal deficits in the phonological domain. So they were problems with phonological awareness, principally, which was difficult for all children to acquire, and specifically difficult for children with dyslexia. And there were broader phonological problems, so verbal memory problems, problems in naming, problems particularly in rapid naming. So the predominant view was that dyslexia was caused by a phonological deficit. It's in the speech processing aspects of language, and it was observed in children who were of high ability, above average intelligence with very low reading skills. So that was the original definition back there in the 70s.
That's fascinating.
I think that the tide began to turn in the middle 80s, principally by Keith Stanovich, who argued that if you took dyslexia and you looked at the phonological problems, but you also took children with lower IQ who had reading problems, they shared the same level of phonological deficits. So he said, really, the phonological processing impairments are important, but this discrepancy definition is really not necessary. So if you just adhere to that, you're leaving vulnerable many children who don't have this discrepancy, but who have the same kind of problem learning to read. So the tide started to turn then about the discrepancy definition, which is now, I'd say, mostly discredited. So people no longer look for this discrepancy between general cognitive ability and reading skill when they're identifying dyslexia. So that was one change. From my own thinking, the changes really began more in the 1990s. And that was for two reasons. First of all, Hollis Scarborough published the very first study of children at family risk of dyslexia in 1990. In these studies, researchers recruit children who've got a family member with dyslexia, usually a parent, and they recruit them when they're 3 years of age, around about 3. So this is before they even confront reading instruction, and they follow them through time. And then around about age 8, they will conduct assessments that will identify the children who've gone on to be dyslexic and the children at family risk who've gone on to be free of reading problems and the control group. And then they'll track back through time to look at the precursors of dyslexia. Well, when Hollis Scarborough published her landmark paper, what she demonstrated was that in the preschool years, children with dyslexia had language problems. Now, I didn't believe that at the time, nor did many people in the field. We said, no, it should be a much more specific phonological difficulty. So some of us, and Uta Frith and I were among them, therefore started our own family risk studies. Relatively small scale, the first family risk study that I did, and we did this, and guess what? Hollis Scarborough was actually right. So the preschool profile of children with dyslexia was actually an oral language difficulty. It wasn't a very specific phonological problem that was what research had previously shown. So if we just park that for a moment, at the same time, in 1992, I went to the University of Newcastle, and my friend and colleague there at the time, Dorothy Bishop, had been studying children who, at the age of 4, had a diagnosis of specific language impairment. Now, we now call this disorder developmental language disorder, DLD. So she followed them from the age of 4 through to 5.5, and then on to age 8. But when I arrived in Newcastle, they were just at school leaving age. So she said to me, why don't we follow up these children together? And I said, yeah, okay, interesting. So if you look at the findings of that study, basically between 4 and 5.5, amongst children with a language impairment, some of them resolve their difficulties, we can call them resolved language impairment, and some of them have persistent language problems. We looked at the outcomes of those two groups at the age of 16, and what we found is if their language problems were resolved by 5.5 by school entry, their literacy attainments at 16 were in the normal range. But if they'd had a persistent language impairment, they had very significant language problems. Many of them were dyslexic. And we also showed that their GCSE exam grades were strongly predicted by their, not just by their concurrent literacy, but by their early language at school entry. So this was a second study that really influenced my thinking that actually we needed to think carefully about what was going on in the preschool years for children who went on later to be dyslexic, and not to focus just on phonology or that triple foundation that we all know and love: letter knowledge, phoneme awareness, and rapid naming. But there was something else. There was oral language, and that was impaired, and it was a risk factor for many children who are going on to have dyslexia. So I think in a nutshell, that's the story of how my thinking changed. We did then go on to try and pin it down in a bigger study, but I can go on to that, or you can.
Actually, it kind of leads perfectly into my next question, which is exactly around this. So we know many children are not diagnosed with dyslexia until problems with their reading and writing start to show, whereas oral language skills develop rapidly between the ages of 3 and 6 years. So given what the research, kind of what you've been telling us, is saying about the importance of oral language and the role that this plays in dyslexia outcomes, what are some of the implications for classroom practice?
Well, I think in order to answer that question, I probably need to say a little bit about the risk of dyslexia in these children with language impairment. So we've done a second, much larger family risk study where we directly compared children at family risk of dyslexia and children with preschool DLD. So this was like comparing the old study and the Newcastle study and a control group. And what we find is that if you look at those children, you recruit them at 3.5, and you look at their outcomes at the age of 8, 7% of the typically developing group have reading problems, and that's what you'd expect in a normal population. About 28% or 26%, around that, 4 times as many who are at family risk develop dyslexia, but something like 66 of children with early language problems go on to be dyslexic. So what we really need is a kind of surveillance system that looks at how well prepared children are for entering school and hence entering reading instruction. We used to talk about reading readiness, and it's quite a useful concept. We need these children not only to be well prepared for the phonics they're going to confront, but we need their oral language to be there so that it is a secure foundation for learning to read. So we can use different forms of screening as a first step to pick up children who are vulnerable. We can help children in particularly vulnerable schools or situations to improve their language. And we can identify children who potentially might have DLD, and we can try to, in that window around school entry, try and improve their language, not only so that the chances of dyslexia is reduced, but also so that they can benefit much more fully from schooling.
Could you talk a little bit more about these children who are particularly vulnerable in oral language? Who are they, and how can we support them or spot them in the classroom?
Well, children who are vulnerable to, if you like, getting on the wrong pathway to learning to read, might actually have just be from very disadvantaged homes where language isn't used very much in the environment, perhaps very few books, so the family learning environment is not very rich. It's particularly something that was magnified during COVID when many such children were not in preschool. We've got children coming to school where English is not their first language. They're also very vulnerable. And then, of course, we have children with a range of developmental conditions, for instance, Down syndrome, and also DLD itself, where there is individual disposition or to have language learning problems. So there are actually a range of children, and at that age and stage of development, unless there's a specific chromosomal abnormality, it's very hard to know what group a child is in. And the sort of approach that can help is what we might call a response to instruction or a response to intervention. So if we place children who are vulnerable in a good language-rich school environment, and we monitor their progress, we can then identify children who are not progressing, and we can perhaps intervene more specifically in small group, a kind of tier 2 approach. And then if they still are not improving, then we might need to refer to specialist assistance. So there's a range of children with language learning problems that we as professionals, I think, can be concerned with identifying, so that when they go into school, they have the best chances of doing well, fulfilling their own potential, which of course may not be very, very high, but nonetheless fulfilling their potential. And of course, children with dyslexia can also be then identified. If you have a language-rich environment, we have a phonics screening check in England, but there are other approaches in other jurisdictions that can then identify whether a child is on the right course for learning to read very early, by year 1, age 6. You don't have to wait for age 8 or 9 to make any kind of diagnosis. That's a kind of very old-fashioned model. We need to be intervening early and monitoring response to instruction.
Great. You mentioned this term that I think is really widely used, vocabulary-rich environments. What does that actually look like in classroom practice, or what could parents or teachers do in particular to support these language-rich environments?
Well, I think, first of all, as an aside, I think that teacher education needs to have much more emphasis on language and learning to read, because often teachers are doing their very best, but they find it very hard, 1, to know how to provide the right sort of language-rich environment, and 2, how to identify children who are having difficulties. But teachers need to be aware of their own language. They need to be aware of the pace at which they're speaking. They need to be aware of the use of non-verbal communication to emphasize particular concepts, particular phrases. Then with children, they need to be very clear when they're talking to children that they're looking at them, that they are listening to them, and that they're helping them to recast their sentences if they're not well constructed. They may actively teach vocabulary using contextual approaches, where children are, first of all asked whether they know what words mean, and then they're specifically given instruction to say the words and think of the words, and then put the words in a group, perhaps in different sentences. So a lot of this is, in a way, what many of us would do very naturally with our own children, but we need to ensure that teachers can do this, bearing in mind that the language needs of children in their class will vary enormously. So some children will need more one-to-one recasting sentences, helping them with grammar, than other children who might be very, very fluent. I think the other important role of a teacher is to identify children who are not speaking or who are not listening. So they need to be very observant. Now, sometimes children may not be listening, or they may think they're not listening, but it might be that they can't listen. So they need to not tell them off for not listening, but try and make some observations. Are they not listening because they're not understanding? Do they understand the rules of the classroom? Because if they don't, then they might be misbehaving. And then with regard to speaking, I mean, some children are very quiet, some children are very shy. It's easy to think someone who isn't speaking is just very shy, but take them one-to-one and check out that they actually are fluent, or are they really having language problems. So there's a whole range of rather general things that teachers can do. And obviously we get into sharing books and sharing stories, getting conversation around books, asking questions about books, asking children to predict what's going to happen next in a story, or to retell the story. Can be done in a small group or one-to-one.
Yeah, I think these are all activities that do kind of happen naturally in a preschool classroom or those early years. But I think sometimes they can be used as sort of a placeholder for, oh, let's read a book while really quickly while we wait for lunch. And actually they are really rich language provoking and language stimulating environments and moments that really should be paid more attention to. And like you said, behavior is one that's coming out of the pandemic as being a bit of an issue, and crowd control kind of being something that teachers have to resort to. But actually, behavior and language are very intricately linked, and we should be looking at that before thinking it's purely a behavioral issue.
Mm, mm. I think the other thing is that we perhaps have underestimated the role of language in learning to read. That sounds stupid, I know, because reading is basically just written language. But we know that probably the most robust evidence for how to teach reading is a phonic approach. And we also know that for children with dyslexia, we need to slow that approach down, use multisensory techniques, break down the task, rather explicitly teach spelling concepts. So using reading and writing in concert. But language is terribly important. So we've shown in our research that early language is the predictor of phonological awareness. And if you think about it, that's not surprising, because if you're asking a child to, for instance, blend some sounds together, as we know, phonemes just don't stick together, but to blend them, you have to actually sort of push them together and then think about the word in your lexicon that will actually tell you what the word is. So you are drawing on your vocabulary, even if you're doing a phonological awareness exercise. If you're using phonics, and particularly in our language, which is very irregular, if you read an irregular word like, I don't know, a stomach, let's say, stomach, well, you've got to have a lexical entry for stomach in your mind to think about how you can change stomach into something that's meaningful. So even with a very stringent phonics approach, children are using language, and if children don't have good language, that's another handicap for them. And of course, lots of children with dyslexia who have relatively good language use it quite skillfully to not to guess, but to predict words when reading prose, and then they'll also use it to bootstrap their decoding attempts. And that's a strategy that many able dyslexic children do have at their disposal. So some able dyslexic children actually read with understanding quite well, although if you heard them, you'd think there's loads of errors, but they can kind of get to the meaning. But that also highlights the problem for children with dyslexia who've got a language problem, because they can't use context and they can't bootstrap their decoding. And so they have huge problems, not just with decoding, but also with reading comprehension.
You read my thoughts right there, Maggie. Thinking back to these children with both DLD and dyslexia, they don't really have much to support themselves on. We have a question from the audience. What can be the signs of dyslexia in children ages 3 to 7?
Well, I would be very cautious about answering that question. The best predictor in the preschool years of whether or not you're going to be dyslexic is whether there's a dyslexic person in the family. That's by far the best predictor. And it remains a very strong predictor up until school entry. At school entry, the best prediction of dyslexia or not would be a combination of language, phoneme awareness, letter knowledge, and rapid naming, the ability to rapidly recall digits or symbols or colors. And it's important to emphasize that that's true across languages. Now, obviously in Chinese, they don't have letters and they don't rely on phonemes. It's not an alphabetic language. But in Chinese, the predictors are vocabulary, phonological awareness of the tones of the language, rapid naming, and character recognition. So we think of this important foundation. But in preschool, because you get a lot of in preschool, language is not very stable until about age 4. So prediction is not as strong as people might guess it is from those early years. But family risk of dyslexia is a very strong predictor that a child will be dyslexic. If a parent has dyslexia, it's a 45% chance that their child will also have dyslexia.
Gosh, I think it really highlights the importance of supporting oral language in the early years. If we can't predict just yet, the best thing we can do is making sure that oral language is in place for whatever comes next in that case.
Exactly.
I have a second question from the audience. How do we teach children specifically at a phonics level when most children doing phonics will not have been identified as dyslexic?
Well, the present kind of guidance I know in relation to systematic phonics is that if a child isn't thriving, you give them more phonics. I'm afraid I really disagree with that, so I'm not very popular with our Department for Education. If a child has been struggling with phonics for some time, we need to identify why they're not learning. Many of them will have oral language difficulties. Some of them may have attention problems, so they're not really attending to what they're doing. But I think in any case, we need to have a complementary approach. So alongside phonics, we need to be encouraging children to read books and to try to decode words they don't know phonically. But if phonics doesn't work, we can ask them, first of all, can they see any part of the word that they could decode? We can ask them, do they think it might sound like a word they know? And then thirdly, we can ask them to look at the sentence context and think what might fit. But what we don't want is to encourage guessing. And if dyslexic children are left to their own devices, they will guess and they will not self-correct. So we need to be quite careful in this approach, but it is, in essence, I think you need to complement phonics with language work and reading from books.
Indeed. To start wrapping this up, we have another question from the audience. Which screening assessments do you recommend for UK primary schools?
Well, probably as a founder of Oxford, I'm conflicted, but I think for language, I think the best screener is our language screening tool. This has 4 components. It has receptive vocabulary, so understanding of words, expressive vocabulary, ability to name pictures, sentence repetition, which is a measure of grammar, and listening comprehension, which essentially listen to a story and answer some questions. So we've shown that's a very reliable tool. It's very robust. It identifies children with language difficulties. When it comes to reading, I think that there are a number of different assessments on the market. We developed the YARC, the York Assessment of Reading and Comprehension, and there's a sort of an early version of that which has phoneme awareness, letter knowledge, doesn't have rapid naming. We have in Oxford, we have a reading screener, which is you read words and non-words. So in a sense, it's a bit like the phonics screening check, which the English kids will get in year 1. Then there's I think the most popular tools for reading assessment at the moment would be the American, the ones by Wagner and Torgerson, who are, of course, leading researchers, and that's the Towery as a test of reading fluency. I should mention spelling, though, because, if you want to screen your class for dyslexia, the best way to do it is a group spelling test. There's no doubt about it. You don't have to administer it individually. You can look not just at the number of spellings children get correct, but you can look at the errors they make and the nature of the errors. Some children with dyslexia will still be having trouble reflecting on the sound structure of words, and that will be revealed by the spelling errors. It's like a window on their phonological processing. They will leave out spelling, leave out syllables, they will leave out reduce consonant clusters, or they may just spell very phonically, very phonetically. And if they do, that's a kind of good sign they're getting on the right track. And then you need to go in there with a specific spelling approach. So very often when we're thinking about dyslexia, we're thinking about reading. That's the first thing that shows up. But of course, the long-standing problems are much more in spelling and writing. So what you could say is, if you're going to screen in school, you could do language screening and spelling.
Yeah, sounds good. Specifically about language, I feel like there's a very strong focus in the early years on oral language, and we kind of lose that as we head into primary school. How is there a point where we stop screening for oral language, or should we be monitoring these children, for several years?
I don't think you need to monitor the whole class for several years. I think that would be a false economy, as it were. I think that if you use a kind of response to instruction framework, you, by the end of the first sort of year of good mainstream work, possibly small group interventions, you need to be continuing to monitor maybe the bottom 10% who've got difficulties. But once a child is once a child's also reading, their language is improving through reading and through the words and the sentence structures and the grammar they learn through written language. So once they're on track, there's really no point continuing to screen. But if they're not on track, so I think you have to make a decision as to who are you going to track in the long term, and who can you let go. So I would say certainly by the end of the first key stage, we don't need to be monitoring. That doesn't mean to say that if you're in an area where there's a lot of perhaps multilingual backgrounds or a lot of disadvantage, you might not want to do a screen later on for everybody. But in terms of monitoring, I think you need to be monitoring the kids who are vulnerable. And of course, some above them, because we always make a cutoff, don't we? Say 10%, but of course there'd be some child lurking of 12%, and then the next time you assess them, they're down at 8% because of the standard error of measurement. So we need to be not just the children you definitely said these kids need language intervention, but some percentage above that as well. And that needs to be, I think, decided by the school management team and how that's approached.
Great, thank you. And I guess just to finish, we're at time, please tell us, what is a key message you think it would be important for our attendees to hear regarding dyslexia?
I think we know a lot about dyslexia. We know a lot about its nature, we know a lot about its causes, and actually we know a lot about robust interventions, and there are a lot of robust interventions. There are a lot of systematic reviews of what you can do with dyslexia. So the really important call to action with dyslexia is that, unfortunately, we've got to go back to where we were probably in the 1970s, and we have to just keep lobbying for services for children with dyslexia. But I think we also have to have an enlightened approach, and we have to know that it's not all dyslexia, because one of the really downsides of increased awareness of dyslexia is that it gets used as a bit of an umbrella term. And we now know that dyslexia, and indeed all neurodevelopmental disorders, tend to co-occur. So many children with dyslexia will have an attention problem. Many will have a language problem. Of course, as you know, many have dyscalculia, very many. So we need, with our own children, to think very carefully, by pushing the dyslexia label, is that helpful, or is there something else we should be looking at? So I think particularly this overlap between dyslexia and language disorder is important to focus on. And it's very interesting that this month isn't just Dyslexia Awareness Month, but of course, we're going to have DLD Awareness Day in a couple of, it's next week, I think. The two disorders are more common than we ever thought. Although going right back to Samuel Orton in 1925, he said, dyslexia is a disorder of the language faculty. So he told us then, and we focused a lot on the reading part, but the language part is also very important for compensation, but also to bootstrap.
Gosh, almost back to basics, isn't it? Thank you so much, Maggie. That was really fascinating. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. And as a reminder to the audience, you will receive a copy of the recording, so look out for this in your inbox in the next couple of days. And follow us, Oxford and Assessment, on social media, where we are regularly sharing research and insights in this area. Thank you, and have a really good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Maggie.
Bye. Bye.